symphony music there. Okay, record screen. Okay, so I've got a topic for you guys today. Whoops, I was looking here instead of here. I've got a topic for you guys today. We're going to talk about judgment and specifically on swords and on wrath, which are pretty heavy topics, actually. Before I do that, though, here, I want to show you what I've got going here. Let me throw my 360 camera on here real quick. Let me see. So here's my room. I'll be right back. So I don't know if you can see that or not, but here's my setup. All of this just to film. All right, so I've got my Lumix here on the little tripod, which is fine. I'm filming at an odd time of the day. It's in the last part of the afternoon. So I've got some natural light coming in from the window here, and I've accentuated it here with my little floodlight here. I've got this little mini one over here on the shelf here, which also is on a little clamp that can pivot around. It's really kind of cool. My desk light here that I just use on a regular basis anyways, just for some more practical light. But this is my setup for now. I've got all my gear on the bed and on the floor over here. But see, look here up on the ceiling. I didn't even turn it on. Let me get up there and show you what this does. If you touch it, it goes between cold light and warm light, and then you can just hold your finger and it gets dimmer or brighter, which is really kind of cool. You know, I'll turn that off because I don't really need it right now. I have it up there so that when I'm filming here in this chair right here, then I can have an overhead rim light, which adds kind of a cool little effect, I think. But I figured before I got heavy with the topic today, I might as well just show you around my little studio here, my little quarantine room. The odd thing about the quarantine is this is basically where I spend most of my time anyway, so, I better stop this. I'll edit that in later and hopefully it'll be cool. I spend most of my time in here anyway, so the quarantine is not really that big a difference as far as my day-to-day routine anyways. So there it is. I've been thinking a lot lately about the concept of the sword of the Lord, a sword in general. It's weird. I was, you know how one topic leads to another. I was working on something else, and it took me to the beginning of the book, Genesis, and the Garden of Eden. And so I was looking at that a little deeper, and it came to the part where God chased them out in verse, chapter 3. I'm going to go there real quick. This will work. Genesis 3. We scroll down to the bottom. You know what happens. The serpent tricks Eve into sinning, and which is interesting because in this stretch here, I kept looking for, the reason I came here was I was looking for where God forgave them, or if he did at all. There's no account that God ever forgave Adam and Eve of this. And then they have their kids, and then it just moves on and leaves Adam and Eve hanging. The only time we really hear Adam is just in passing references every now and then. Paul attributes sin entering into the world because of Adam, which is also curious because Eve is the one that sinned. And even though Paul acknowledges that elsewhere, it's interesting that he puts that on the man, which I don't know if that's for better or worse. It was really the serpent. Although the serpent just deceived them. He didn't really lie. Because he says here, you will not surely die. This is verse 4. You will not surely die. For God knows that in the day that you eat of it, your eyes will be opened. That ties into our discussion on blindness and sight. And you will be like God, knowing good and evil. In other words, be able to judge, to accurately judge, which is what got me into this topic to begin with, via a sword. We're going to talk about a sword in a minute. So, you know the deal. Adam sins, or Eve sins, and then Adam sins, and then God calls them all up and tells them their punishment, the serpent and Adam and Eve, which is a whole study in and of itself. But at the end of chapter 3, it says, the Lord God said, behold, the man has become like one of us, to know good and evil. And now, lest he put out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever. ... That's just interesting. That's the quote. It's like he said, starts a sentence and then leaves it hanging there and ends it, and then the narrator takes over. Therefore, the Lord God sent him out of the garden to till the ground from which he was taken. Boy, the truths in that are just phenomenal. If you just stop, you'll sink right into that one. So he drove out the man, and this is what I wanted to show you in verse 24. He drove out the man and placed cherubim at the east of the garden, and a flaming sword, which turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. So the commandment was not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. which means they had access to the tree of life if they had wanted to eat it. I don't know why they never did, but he said, now that they know good and evil, we got to keep them from going to that tree of life. So if you eat the tree of life once, then you live forever. Is that what I'm to understand here? Or do you need to continually eat of the tree of life and it will continue to keep you alive forever? There's some things here. I think that, on a side note, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that there was nothing special about the tree itself. I think God just picked one at random because it was in the middle. I think there were probably a whole grove of trees just like it. I think what made it stand out as different, what made it the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, was the fact that God said not to eat of it. He attached a commandment to it. The only commandment that Adam and Eve had at that time. Do whatever you want, go whatever you want, it's all yours, except one thing, he said. There's a tree in the middle, don't eat of that. And the day that you eat of that, you'll die. Because their eyes would be open and they would be able to tell the difference between good and evil where they didn't know it before. And what taught them that was not anything inherent in the tree or in the fruit itself, as though something biological took place where they ate this and somehow their digestion opened their eyes and showed them the difference. It's nonsense. I think that the very fact that they obeyed or disobeyed, obeying is good, disobeying is evil. They had no concept of disobedience because all they've known was obedience, and they didn't have anything to disobey to begin with until God gave them that one command. To me, I think it was just a random tree, not something special. As far as in and of itself, different on a molecular or a biological level at all. I think the fact that God attached a commandment to it was what made it the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Because in the day that they decided to break that command, that was going to be a real eye-opener, if you'll pardon the pun. Their eyes were opened, and they saw, oh, we disobeyed. Now let's see what the results of that are. So through first-hand experience, they were able to tell, here's what happens when we obey, here's what happens when we disobey. And we've been trying to get back to square one ever since. They were innocent. They didn't know. Now they know. Now we all know, because God withdrew. See, the sin happened. There was a separation that took place. God withdrew. And therefore, we're all born into an environment that's separated from God. And now we get to decide, we get to each discover for ourselves what happens when you obey and what happens when you disobey, which I think gets at the heart of the gospel. I wasn't even going to talk about all this. The issue of discerning between good and evil. That's what a sword is. Now, I want to talk to you about that sword because this is the first time it's mentioned here at the end of chapter 3. He drove out the man and placed cherubim at the east of the Garden of Eden. Cherubim. Why to the east and not all the way around? I have no idea. Why cherubim were needed? I don't know. Was Adam going to try to go back in for some reason? Or Eve? So they needed to be there. And what's with the sword? The flaming sword. This word for sword... No, the word for flaming here is only used twice in the whole Bible, and the other time it's enchanted. Enchantment, I think, is the other time it's used. In reference, I think, to the Pharaoh's magicians trying to use enchantment to mimic the things that Moses was doing with the staff and with other stuff. So, an enchanted, flaming... There are plenty of other words for flame and flaming and fire in the Old Testament, but this one is used here specifically to describe this sword. And I don't know, was it a sword in the hand of one of these cherubs, or was it just on its own, like a little sentient, self-aware, animated sword? I don't know. And why it needed to be on fire, I don't know. Fire is a form of judgment, and swords are a form of judgment, and we'll get into that, I hope. But the whole idea that he put a sword there, and it's just said in passing as though, oh yeah, I put a sword there. It doesn't say he invented swords at this point, which makes me think swords existed before God created. You see in other places, like when David numbered the Israelites and there was the punishment that was sent from God for that, which is a whole nother video because I still don't understand what the big sin was. I've talked to my dad and others about it, and I've got ideas, but it still doesn't sit right with me. But when God sent the angel to destroy Jerusalem, let that sink in. David sinned and God sent his angel to destroy Jerusalem. He was going to just level it. That's the city where he put his name. He was going to wipe it out because of David's sin. There are dynamics there that I just don't understand. But the sword of judgment was coming against Jerusalem because of David's sin. The sword was in the hand of the angel. The angel had a sword. A spiritual being had a sword. You know that. So So swords existed before the Garden of Eden. Swords existed probably before God created the universe and created man and created the earth. What does God need a sword for? What do people need swords for in the spirit realm? Is there war? Swords are symbolic of war and of judgment. Swords pierce into an issue and divide it and lay it bare. It uncovers secrets. A sword is a physical manifestation of the act of judging somebody. I am judging you. I'm angry at you. You'll see how wrath connects here in a minute. My anger is expressed in an act of judgment against you. I'm trying to judge you, trying to kill you. Judge you on as though you have done something to anger me, therefore this is my judgment against you. And that basic concept extrapolates out to the idea of judgment anyways, and whether we're supposed to judge or not. Judge not lest you be judged. And yet there's tons of scriptures that says we're supposed to be good and exercise the ability to judge properly, judge righteous judgment. So the idea of a sword, that there's something hidden. There's no secret, Jesus says, that will not be revealed. There's the sword of the Lord that comes out of his mouth. It's connected to his words, the sword of the Spirit. There's all kinds of stuff about the sword. So anyways, here's this sword that God put on the outside, the east side of Eden, to protect the path to the tree of life. I wonder what happened to Eden, if it just kind of overgrew itself and it's still there somehow, or did God take Eden away? Are those cherubs in that sword still there? I don't know. That's interesting to think about. But it's connected to this idea of sin and of judgment and of revealing the results of what Adam and Eve did. So I'm going to bring this up here. Swords and judgment. Swords. So there's three forms of judgment that are often grouped together in the Old Testament, and that is the sword, famine, and pestilence. There are others that are added here and there on occasion. One would be the beasts of the field as a form of judgment. The other is captivity. Your enemies are going to come against Israel with the sword. And God says, I put my sword into Nebuchadnezzar's hand, and he's going to judge not just Israel, but all of the nations around there. There's a whole stretch in Ezekiel, I believe, where God goes on at length about how he's going to have Nebuchadnezzar come against Egypt and conquer and humble Egypt and judge them. The sword of the Lord comes to judge. And it's connected to wrath. Here, check this out. This is interesting. This is in Exodus 22, 22 through 24. This is God talking through Moses to the people of Israel. It says, you shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. That's important to the Lord. You shall not do that. If you afflict them in any way, and they cry out to me at all, then I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will become hot, and I will kill you with the sword. And your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless. So that kind of completes the loop there. You're going to mistreat the fatherless and the widows, then I'm going to turn your wife and your children into fatherless and widow by judgment, because what judgment you use against others will be used against you. When it says, judge not lest you be judged, it says that a couple times in the Gospels. I don't think it means don't judge at all. It says if you don't judge, then you won't be judged. There's a back and forth. There's a reaping and sowing element of judgment that I think is fascinating. And I went through the whole Old Testament and New Testament on the topic of swords and judgment and all the different forms of judgment that God uses, not just against Israel. He proclaims it against the whole world, just in various places. So, my wrath, he says in Exodus 22, if you afflict them in any way and they cry at all to me, I will surely hear their cry and my wrath will become hot. So this word for wrath is this one here called aff. A-F-F is how it sounds to me, so that's how I wrote it. H639 is the word. It means anger, wrath, and check this out, it means face. And it means nostrils and the nose. So it's anger and wrath are connected to the nose in Hebrew, which is fascinating to me. And the idea is that when you get angry, it's like it's expressed through your nose. and the breath that comes. And it's also the word that means to a duel. When you call someone to account to duel over an issue, it's like your anger is aroused, you got the breath going, and there's judgment that's about to be passed. One person wants to engage someone and confront them, to face them over an issue. And so God says, my wrath will come up, the breath of his nostrils. I love that. They're all connected. It also means double portion, but it means a special version of double portion. When you give somebody a double portion, it's when you give them a double portion in response to, I just bumped the camera, sorry, in response to something that angered you. So you're like, oh yeah, well, I'm going to do this in response and give this person a double portion. So it's tied to the idea of two nostrils. They're right next to each other. I've got big ones, so 2-car garage here. But it's connected with judgment, and it's connected with calling someone to account for something and calling them to a duel, and out come the swords. Dueling judgments here. One man needs to defend himself. So I love the symbolism involved in a sword. Well, I love it in concept. I don't love it when it's run through me. Judgment. So when you judge somebody, you call them to account, in a sense, for something that they've done. And that's, I think, why God talks so strongly about improper judgment. Don't judge with what it looks like. I think Jesus said that in Matthew. Judge not. How does it go? All right, I'm going to scroll. I know it's on here somewhere. Oh, my notes. Where does it say judge righteous judgment? I guess I don't have it on here. All right. I'm going to put it up on the screen where Jesus said, do not judge by appearance, but judge righteous judgment. Because if you called someone to account, you got out the sword of judgment, you're going to issue, this is my decision, I'm going to pierce this thing open and flay it. That'll kill people, you know that. I mean... That's kind of the point. When armies would clash, when their swords would come out and they would fight, that's judgment on several different levels. On a meta scale, as far as God sends the children of Israel into a land as judgment against it and kill everything that's in there. So on a meta scale, the armies clash. That's the generals or the leaders who are clashing in judgments against one another. And then you take it down to the soldiers on the field with the sword in his hand, and they're fighting each other. So those are little miniature acts of judgment that are happening on a small scale within the context of the larger judgment of one giant body going against another. Yeah, it's an ugly business. It's ugly business, the sword. That's why I think that God takes it so seriously. And the issue of us learning how to judge properly is it's not just in the Gospels, but Paul talks about it quite often as well. So yeah, the sword. You've got to be careful with that thing, man. It'll cut you, it'll cut someone else. You bring that thing out, and then you don't wave it around like a toy. That's why I think we need to take the issue of judgment seriously. Abimelech called out to his Abimelech is an interesting person. That's in Judges 9. It was one of Gideon's sons. Gideon had 70 sons, and then he had a son with one of his servants, servant ladies. So it was kind of like half his son, I guess you could say his half son. Because he wasn't married to her, from what I believe. So Gideon was a judge of Israel, and then he had 70 sons, which I suppose were then going to co-judge. We're going to judge. Well, we're talking about judgment. So they would settle issues for the people of Israel. And so Abimelech killed them all. He said he went to his the people that he came from. So Gideon was his father, and his mother was from Shechem, which I think is related to Israel in some capacity. But he went to them and said, "Why would you want another of Gideon's sons to rule over you when you can have someone of your own people?" And here they gave him money, and he hired a bunch of roughnecks, and they went and killed all of the sons of Gideon. Dang, God could have stopped that. He allowed it. That boggles my mind. Here, after all Gideon did, man, God let one of his sons kill 70 of his other sons. So one of them, named Jotham, I think, was the one that escaped because he was out of town, I guess. But the other 70 got killed. And then it said they made Abimelech king. I asked my mentor, one of my mentors, about this because it's universally set forth that Saul was the first king of Israel. And if you look it up online, Saul's listed as first, but Abimelech was quite a bit before Saul. And it said in 922, Judges 922, that he ruled over Israel for 3 years. And they called him the king. Melech, it's the same word for king. So yeah, that's an interesting story as far as judgment. you're a ruler over a country, man. You've got the final judgment. Moses ran into that when he was leading the children of Israel. His father-in-law, Jethro, told him, you're going to drive yourself into the ground if you just try to judge every little issue that comes up every day. From sun up to sundown, you're going to be busy judging people. You can't do that. You got to find quality people that you can put into positions of authority over groups of 100 and groups of 1,000 and groups of 10,000, so that they can deal with most of the little issues that come up, and the really tough ones they can bring to you. Then you'll have some free time to do some stuff yourself instead of just sitting on the judgment seat 24/7. The judgment seat. So when I look up the word judgment in the New Testament, there's a couple aspects of it. One is called the judgment, like a capital T and a capital J, and that says in the day of judgment. There's lots Jesus says about this city will rise up in the judgment and condemn you on that day, kind of thing, or the judgment seat. We all have to appear before the judgment seat. So the judgment is sort of an event that will happen at some point in the future. Then there's judgments that are issued like from a court, like a case comes up and this is the judgment. All right, and then you have to follow that this will be executed. And that kind of connects with our discussion last time about forgiveness. But judgment at a specific court case, so to speak. Then there are judgments in general. It says these are the judgments of the Lord. They're like laws, precepts. There were tons of those given in the Old Testament, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers. These are the judgments that you guys need to follow. These are the ordinances and rules that God has set forth, and you need to obey them. You must obey them. And then there's judgment, which is our skill. The judgment that we have, where we can evaluate and assess things and come to conclusions. And so it's interesting trying to parse all of that, because the same word is used to describe all four of those aspects. And then there's other words. So it's an interesting study in and of itself. But that idea of the sword that comes in here, let me show you a couple more of these verses that have to do with swords. Abimelech fell on his sword. That's the reason I brought it up. He told his armor bearer to kill him, and he did. The one who fell on his sword was Saul in the battle when him and his sons all got killed. Saul wanted his armor bearer to run him through, but the armor bearer was afraid, so Saul fell on his own sword, which is rich with symbolism as well. And then when his assistant, his armor bearer, saw that, he fell on his sword as well. Interesting concept. They live by the sword, you'll die by the sword. There's a lot of verses that say that. The sword shall never depart from your house, it says in 2 Samuel, because you have despised me. Isaiah 66, for by fire and by his sword will the Lord plead with all flesh, and the slain of the Lord shall be many. Job 19:29, be afraid of the sword, for wrath brings punishment of the sword, that you may know that there is a judgment. So the idea of a sword is tied in with judgment throughout the Old Testament. Jeremiah 47, O you sword of the Lord, how long until you are quiet? Put yourself up into your scabbard and rest and be still. There's so many. I'll let you, if you want to just search the word sword and just set aside some time and go through it. It's a real eye-opener. Revelation, when Jesus returns, here's Revelation 1:16. He had in his right hand 7 stars, and out of his mouth went a sharp two-edged sword. His countenance was like the sun shining in its strength. So that's tied into the words. His words, when he speaks those judgments, they pierce and they cut and they reveal. It says that in Hebrews. I'm sure you're familiar with that one. 4:12. For the word of God is living and powerful and sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even to the division of soul and spirit, of joints and marrow. And it is a discerner of the thoughts and intents of the heart. It goes deep, man. It pierces right into that. I think Jesus says that in another place, that there's no secret that will not be revealed. Everything will be made open. That's one of the byproducts of light. So when I'm contemplating swords and famine and pestilence and fire as all different forms of judgment, swords pierce and divide and make open so people can see it. So when the light shines, people can see. This is what was hiding inside of there. Fire comes and it devours and it purifies, which are two different forms, other forms of judgment. Comes in and consumes. It's consumptive. All of those forms of judgment are consumptive, really. And purifies and refines. So it gets all the nonsense out. It comes in and judges. Once the sword is laid at bare, the fire comes in. From the outside in, it comes in and purifies and consumes. Pestilence is from the inside out, and that's just like rot. That's also consumptive. I don't think there's anything purifying about pestilence. And then the other forms, captivity and other things that that God brought onto Israel throughout its history, because they just wouldn't obey him. God, that's got to be so frustrating to the Lord. Maybe, or maybe he expects that from us. I don't know. I've been talking with others about the idea of total depravity, which is a whole nother topic altogether. The fact that we are just all born hopelessly corrupt and sinful and there's nothing we can do but sin. I take issue with that. I think that's nonsense. I think that's an oversimplification that only has as its end the idea that we can still continue to do whatever we want every day. Oh, what do you expect? I'm a sinner. I have to sin. I'm born completely corrupt and lost and whatever. I think that the sword comes and puts that to the test. It'll lay that open. Yeah, total depravity. There's something, I'm going to have to do another whole video on Calvinism and on narcissism and on the 5 points, the doctrines of grace that Calvinists use. And they're vehement about it, man. Those guys are passionate about that, but that's just one chocolate mess top to bottom. Okay, so I think I've meandered through this long enough. Revelation 19:15, out of his mouth, Jesus' mouth, goes a sharp sword, and with it he'll strike the nations, and he himself will rule them with a rod of iron. He himself treads the winepress of the fierceness and wrath of Almighty God. So the judgment, the fire, the rod of iron, wrath, all of these things are connected. And it's in response to things that we do, to how we live, to our behavior, and whether God's in us and we're close to him, or whether we're sinning and separate from him, all the way back to the Garden of Eden. The day that you disobey God, your eyes will be open and you'll say, oh, oops. That's what happens when I disobey. I think that's what this life is supposed to teach all of us. We're born into a realm that is cursed, meaning it's sinful, meaning that it's separated from God. If God was here and walking with us each in the garden, the cool of the day, in our own garden, so to speak, then I think that would be a different issue altogether, because the momentum would be pushing us towards serving him. But now that he's gone and we're made in his image and then born into an environment that's separated from him, I think we can't help but stumble around in the dark. We're in darkness. We need to learn the benefits of serving him and obeying him through direct experience. I don't think it's something we can learn as a concept. I think that's the purpose of this life, is to teach each of us the pros and cons of serving him and disobeying him, so that when his kingdom comes, we are ready. And that's knowledge that we learn the hard way firsthand through tasting that sword and that fire and that pestilence when the time was there, to show us, to catch us up short and say, okay, now I get it. Now I understand the consequences of disobedience. I'm going to do what God says from now on. Anytime there's an issue, I'm going to default to obeying him because I don't want to taste that sword anymore. That sword is harsh, and that's the judgment of the Lord. And he doesn't judge. He judges righteous judgment because he doesn't judge based on his own impulses. He judges based on what God is telling him. And I think that's how we each need to learn how to do, is to judge things and people and situations based on what God's saying us and not on what we're seeing. And our anger rises up and out comes the sword, and we judge people, and God says, all right, I saw what you did there. You didn't have all the information, and you went flying around with that sword. That sword that you're using, you're going to have that turned on you too. See if there's anything cuttable in you, anything that needs to be pierced and laid open, because whatever judgment you use will be used against you. So the idea of learning to use and develop that skill, it's a sign of maturity. That's another thing it says in Hebrews, that their senses exercised to discern between good and evil. So yeah, the sword of the Lord, that's a heavy topic. It's heavy. And I think we all need to taste it on some level. I'm wondering if that's what God uses to prune us. The idea of pruning is also pretty big, especially in the book of John. But that sword comes and it cuts, man, and it cuts deep. And it cuts, it's a positive. Boy, it hurts like the dickens, though. Amos 1:11, thus says the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Edom, that's tied to Esau, and for 4 I will not turn away its punishment. That's the ramification. Because he pursued his brother with the sword, and he cast off all pity. His anger tore perpetually, and he kept his wrath forever. You see that? The sword, judgment, mercilessness, wrath, it's all connected. He says, if you would ease up and put that sword away, then we could get somewhere. I could show mercy to you, but you showed no mercy to your brothers, then to your brother Jacob, to Israel. You showed him no mercy. That's why God wiped out Edom completely. That sword, man. So pulling out the sword is judgment. Putting that sword away is mercy. And it's the difference between war and peace, and beating your plowshares into swords, or your swords back into plowshares. You're not going to judge. I'll let God take care of it. I'm just going to show mercy, and I'll be shown mercy as a result. So the dynamics there are really interesting, and it's very, very practical, very right now, very every person in your life. How are you dealing with them? Are you evaluating and judging and coming in as the executioner, or are you evaluating and judging but then deferring to God and saying, I don't know, Lord, what do you say? And that's where you learn to really see, and that's where it's connected to blindness and to sight. And the day that you eat thereof, your eyes will be opened, and you'll be able to tell the difference between good and evil, is what happened to Adam and Eve, because they saw, whereas before they didn't even realize they were blind. Okay, I'm going to stop now because I've gone for way too long. And yeah, this was interesting. I hope you enjoyed that on some level. And I've got plenty more topics I want to hit soon, and we'll see if it actually happens or not. I even got a short film I want to make, but I don't know. All right, I'll talk to you guys later and see you. Bye.